Hey Collective, it's Alan coming to you with a video that will be accompanying a post I'm releasing either this afternoon or tomorrow early in the afternoon, surrounding a very sacred topic that I really hold near and dear to me, and is based on a sacred text that we will discuss in a moment. But before we begin, I just have to let you guys know that if you hear horns blaring all around me, it's because construction's, like everything's being rebuilt around me as well. So if you hear horns, you kind of have to forgive the environment, and also you might either hear a dog's neighbor or the fan in the background because it's the week before Halloween, and typical to LA fashion, it's like 100 degrees outside. So if you see the fan or my hair moving, it's not for any type of ego. It has more to do with just being hot. So basically what this piece is going to center around is the topic of something that I came across a while ago that really sat with me as though my soul registered it, having either learned it before or somehow having been involved in something because it was so instrumental to who I am as a person, that it spoke to my soul's heart as opposed to the mind or the ego. And it centers around a very sacred text by the name of Pistis Sophia that actually centers around a very important figure of divine feminine energy that exists even before our civilization that as we understand it came to be. And in its sacred text, it's actually a remarkably beautiful bedtime story for the soul, and that you will probably register it as somehow knowing that it's true, and that it speaks a lot more volume to what we and the collective consciousness are going through right now, and some of the struggle that we face as beings dressed in physical garb. So the story of Miss Sophia basically begins in the plenoma, which is the clouds within the deity that we call the divine, and in a headspace essentially before actualizing into the physical realm, where there was a divine feminine stationed at the 13th eon, meaning the 13th step before perfection, who manned the station of wisdom. She was the incarnation and as being of wisdom itself, and her position was of that stature. But she became curious, depending on which of the two storylines you listen to, whether it's the Gnostic text or that of Pistis Sophia written. It's a story of a chronological story of conversations that Jesus had with his disciples, specifically with Mary Magdalene that we'll get into later. But specifically, there are two timelines or two storylines in which we will discuss it. But essentially, she became curious or somehow interested in getting to know the divine at a much deeper level, and decided that she would go and create of her own accord, meaning that she was going to leave her station in order to do what wisdom needs to do, which essentially apply knowledge to something in order to understand more the process of creation. But in doing so, in abandoning her station and abandoning her counterpart, she individualized in stepping off of that position and descended into the land of shadow, where in the Gnostic text, it's spoken to as because she did something forbidden of her own accord, she stepped and she fell into the shadow lands where she was going to have to face consequences for what she had done. And because of her single act of defiance, she begat an energy called the demiurge, which was the form of ego that we as humans now battle internally as a byproduct of her stepping off that post. Whereas in Pistis Sophia, it is spoken to by Jesus when he's speaking to his disciples that she actually wasn't making a mistake. It wasn't something she did. She was actually tricked by one of her brethren into believing that to be closer to God was to follow a light that was below her, thinking that it would lead to her divinity and to understanding, but in reality it was a trap in which he was basically assaulting her. And so when she stepped into it, she descended into what we now call physical matter and was tormented and followed by this energy eternally, whereas in the Gnostic text, it is the demiurge that is born from her that then does the pursuing and torture of Miss Sophia. But the interesting part of Miss Sophia is that it's written in two different perspectives. One is from more a toxic masculine side that blames the feminine for being curious, and it's kind of almost condemning her behavior as something negative, whereas Jesus spoke to it as a positive thing, and we'll go into the story of why that is as we go. So as Miss Pistis, as Sophia descended into the realm of shadow, she begat the demiurge, which would be the ego, the toxic masculinity that we now experience as the false god, the one who believes that they are the ultimate power, yet have no creative measure or any true power within themselves, but cast illusions upon society, claiming that it is the one, separate obviously from the actual divine, who, as you will probably know from being a faithful person, does not need to announce himself. He is what he is. I am that I am. He doesn't have to prove anything. So you begin to see the separation between the two perspectives. One has a more toxic masculine side to it, and it blames the feminine, as in the story of Adam and Eve, of course, where Eve is the one who eats from the forbidden tree of good and evil, and yet you still understand that the tree was there to begin with. So why was the temptation there if it wasn't part of a bigger plan? And as we explore the story of Miss Sophia and her descent essentially into madness, we discover that if it was not for her action, none of us would ever exist. So as Miss Sophia, whether tricked by a brother or of her own accord, when she descends off her position and falls into the Shadowland, she begins to experience all of the different things that can happen in darkness. And she physically is going through the trauma and turmoil that the divine had asked us not to do. Remember, the divine says to us, the principle of the true God says, do not eat from this tree or you will suffer consequences. But in her innocence, naivety, and her purity, she was not prepared for the journey that she stepped into and descended into the bowels of hell, where she was tormented by all of those who worship the evil demiurge that believes himself to be... Basically, you ever meet like a guy who likes to beat up women? That type of dude. So that energy was born of Miss Sophia, basically was his mother. And he decides to torment her, believing that she is lesser than he and that he is the only God, etc., etc., etc. Which, there is only one divine, but this is the shadow version of that. And in her process of stepping into it, created what we now face as duality. The higher light versus the darker shadow that lives within us. So as descendants of her and the Christ, we then wage a war within ourselves in order to find our way back up into the higher heavens, whatever you believe that to be. So as she goes about her journey, she lives several incarnations, being tortured, followed, and all of this stuff throughout all space and time. And out of the purity of her repentance and begging for forgiveness for not having listened to the Holy Father, she finally, her voice raises to the highest levels of heaven across all space and time. And the Divine Father hears her pleas in purity and innocence and truth. And he immediately dispatches a rescue crew. Now, depending on whether you read Pistis Sophia or you listen to the Gnostic text, it is Jesus either way. But in one, he's also with Michael and Gabriel, those archangels, who descend upon into the Shadowland in order to rescue Miss Sophia because of her earnest desire and understanding of what had happened. But the interesting part is not only do they rescue her, but it is Jesus himself who also, in the way that we understand all Christianity and all things, paid the ultimate sacrifice in his own journey on behalf of humanity. You find that in the act of defiance that they claim as Sophia did, that she too suffered the consequences as a feminine. So you begin to see the reemergence of the masculine energy in right alignment and the divine feminine energy proving her worth. And as she begins to ascend, she must clear all the different levels, being led by none other than Jesus himself. And that's according to Pistis Sophia. So again, I would say if you're a student or you found the actual blog post that I put on LinkedIn interesting, I would highly suggest you read both the version of the Gnostic text and that of Pistis Sophia. Because Pistis Sophia is going to be incredibly important to those of you who are more advanced students. Because you're going to understand exactly who she is by the time you're done reading it. But the purpose of this video, let's keep going. So as he begins to come and help her with Michael and Gabriel, they have to clear the different levels of hell in the repentance, in the purity. Meaning, she has to pay back the karmic debt and all of the other stuff that we would equate to the everyday experience, only she's being held by Jesus. And interestingly enough, in the story of Pistis Sophia, which is the Chronicles of Jesus talking to his disciples, you learn that as they go up the ladder, as she has to clear each level on her way back to where she belongs, she has to pass through the archons, who are the shadow versions that come from the demiurge, who were born as counterbalances in the way that the demiurge is born of the innocence and purity of Sophia, the two polar opposites, the duality born. Then the archons are also the shadow version of the aeons. And so there's a lot going on at the time that she's trying to make her way up. But as we know, as we spiritually explore, we know that you must be prepared for unity back to your rightful place. And you understand that it's all about integration, where the duality must be merged into one, and it must go up a certain procession. And as you make your way up, you become more and more enlightened, and you become whole again. And it is the wholeness that allows you into the higher realms, that again, she is the gatekeeper too. And here's what I mean. So as she makes her way up, notice that Jesus is with her. And they, as they begin to encounter them, are asking for the clearances. And if you've ever read the Emerald Tablets in the Book of Thoth, or Thoth, he speaks specifically to the version of archons that we're talking about, the shadow keepers that try to trap souls into believing the materialistic world and all the other stuff, right? The darker edge of life. Basically, our own shadow. Our ego gets in the way. You know what I mean? Like, all of us have ego, and most of the time that we get ourselves into trouble, it's typically because the ego is in action, and it believes itself to be the rightful heir to everything, and everything's owed to the ego, but in reality, us as students know that that's false. So you have to do the work. And so as she does the work, she's being held, her hand's being held by Jesus, Michael and Gabriel standing on the post. And as they're going up, interestingly, as they're clearing her with whatever the clearance levels you have to have, they keep staring at Jesus, who's standing behind her. And wouldn't you believe it, according to Pistis Sophia, they don't recognize him at first. And he gets to bear witness as he's going with her to the different levels and what is the criteria and so forth. Now, in Pistis Sophia, it gets really good. He finally looks at them when they ask him for his clearances, and he goes, I don't need the clearances. And he looks deep into them like I'm looking at you, and he says, do I? And every single one of them immediately go, oh my God, I didn't know it was you. I'm so sorry, sir. And they all look down, and they pretend that, oh, my sorrow, you know, like they're busted, right? And they're like, oh shit. Like, oh no, the boss is here, and like all this stuff. Meanwhile, he's still walking Miss Sophia, so he's literally going up each of the levels. And he's basically rescuing the soul who has paid their debt for whatever you believe that you're in. But as she makes her way back to her position, understand that she is now able to hold her mystery. See, the great thing about the demiurge and the more toxic masculinity is they blame her for creating all of the paths that we fall into the depths of hell. And yet it is through her that we also learn the process of redemption and how to make our way home. Jesus came because he himself had gone through the journey, and he understood the strength and courage it took her to go through the ordeal that she has, and was the only being that the Christ believed, that the divine really believed him, that could go and get her and that she would listen to. Because she had been tortured and tormented, and she was like going crazy and stuff. Like, they would not leave her alone. All of the worst things that can happen to someone happened to Miss Sophia. But in her pathway up, she left us breadcrumbs in Pistis Sophia of how to make our way home. And it's through Jesus. So this does not contradict Christianity or any church. It actually adds a different layer of understanding the feminine principle and how, if it were not for her sacrifices in which she endured, that the feminine would not have risen into unity to hold the position she was appointed to do. And this is the key part of the blog that you guys will have read. Wisdom is only acquired if the knowledge you bear is applied to an actual setting or scenario or set of circumstances. And in many forms, if we believe in a school or reform school or a prison, your repentance is based on how you interact with the world around you. Had she not descended from her post, how could she ever be the wisdom bearer? She would have been a glib student. She would not have been holding the 13th mystery. She would have been holding knowledge, unapplied, not in her rightful place, and not able to hold her position. So the question for you as students then becomes, well, did she actually make a mistake? Or was it her journey of showing her worth? And did she pave the way for the feminine part of our universe to rise to a rightful power? Because in her wake, you would now come to know her as the queen of our universe. It is only because of Miss Sophia, who chose to descend of her own accord, that individuation began. And the journey of the lost souls could not have found their way back had she not suffered the ultimate sacrifice. Something that is immortally captured in the story of Pistis Sophia, which has boggled the minds of even the most advanced of some teachers. And they do not understand why, of all the sacred ancient texts that they found, it is the heaviest and thickest. Because it goes through literally the journey and breadcrumbs And it shows you the path out if you have the eyes to see and the ears to hear, which is why I'm speaking to you. So, with things being as above, so below, we can see the story further depicted in the actual interaction between how Pistis Sophia exists, which is in the narration and the chronicling of conversations that Jesus is having with Mary Magdalene. You see, Mary Magdalene, in the story of Pistis Sophia, is the only one of the disciples who completely understands why Jesus keeps talking to her about Sophia. And you realize that there is a reason why Mary Magdalene understands it. As above, so below. So if you can understand the concept that the Christ and Jesus is the son of the Christ, then you understand who is the daughter of Sophia. You see, in the journey of divinity, in order to take your rightful place, you must become whole. And you must balance the energies of masculinity and femininity within you in order to truly resume your position and your post of whatever you're trying to accomplish. A divine being is a balance. It's a tempered being that has brought the toxic masculinity under control and the toxic feminine qualities under control and begins to progress its way upwards, integrating the best parts of itself into a unified vision that then stands before the world and before God, whatever you call God to be. I call him the divine, but you can call him whatever you want. Separate from the demiurge, who is shadow and nothing but ego, and wants to trap you into believing whatever it is that the shadows are trying to cast upon you. See Plato's Cave, that's pretty illuminating. So, you learn that the reason why Mary Magdalene was the one who was so clear on it is because she's a descendant of Miss Sophia. And it is Mary Magdalene, as we know, it's not a misunderstanding here. We know that after Christ is crucified, after Jesus is crucified, it is Mary Magdalene and John who carry the message of Christianity forward. And yet, what happens to Mary Magdalene? The exact same thing that happened to Miss Sophia. She's vilified, she's called a whore, they completely destroy her reputation, they suppress her, they hide her, all of it. All the same shit that happened to Miss Sophia and to the Christ, both of them. Remember, one's the divine masculine, one's the divine feminine quality, but we're all part of the whole. So Miss Sophia is technically the feminine side of Christ. And so as she proves her worth and makes her way back to her rightful place, she comes along with one of the most precious gifts that the Christ has ever seen. Someone else able to co-create with him and put the proof in the pudding, right? She didn't just descend into madness, she overcame it. And in her repentance, in her pathway, he was able to hear her against all odds. The demiurge stopped at nothing. But it was the purity of her heart and her love for the God, for the divine, that he was able to hear her and dispatch the rescue that then promised us the opportunity to be freed of the world that we live in. Now, having said that, I personally don't run around the world castigating because I think it's a beautiful planet. But the point is that in her rise, you see a parallel in the story of Mary Magdalene. Because Mary Magdalene was persecuted and chased and ridiculed, and there were horrible things that they say happened to Mary Magdalene after his departure. And there is a reason then that Christ appears to her first in the resurrection. He shows her that whatever she's going to encounter, that there's a resurrection. He's speaking directly to her physical shadow as though guiding Miss Sophia home. And when you look at the realm of consciousness from that standpoint, you start to begin to understand the mission that we are all a part of. Because had it not been for Sophia, the queen of the universe, what we are experiencing could never be. It was her ultimate sacrifice, no matter how it came to be, that paved the way for you and I to learn from the mistakes that we have incurred. Because remember, before that, the divine already had done all this. The Christ of the divine had already mastered it. And he was in the void. He was just, he was manifesting, creating, and like all that stuff. But he was by himself. It was just him. And he was okay with it. But it was Miss Sophia, a feminine aspect of himself, that went, well, I want to know how you did this. Why? And so in that curiosity, yeah, some people would consider blasphemous, but where would you be without her choice? You see, she took it intuitive moment of individuation that gave you the life that you lead. Miss Sophia is not the villain. She is the fallen person who redeemed herself in the eye of the Almighty. And it was for that reason that he saved her. And he didn't just save her, he sent Jesus to come get her. And where in the annals of space and time do you hear that outside of the story of Princess Sophia? So though I understand the Gnostic text talking about the fact that she did make a mistake, how do children learn sometimes if they don't make those mistakes? And sometimes they learn the hard way. But there comes a point when no matter who you are, we've heard this legend, a mother or father can be millions of miles away and they know when something's wrong with their child. It transcends space and time. And in the purity of who she was, in her naivety, the world is paved with great intentions. In that moment, she birthed us with him. It was the moment that the divine feminine reintegrated herself into the divine masculine, and they were whole. Now, we know that the divine was already whole, but in her journey, think of all the things she did as a byproduct of a mistake she had made. She paid the ultimate price and was tormented for eons. Not aeons, but eons. But the knowledge and wisdom, the knowledge of wisdom that she had acquired from practical application and surviving against all odds is what you would call hope. The gift that she seeds in each of us every day that we breathe and overcome the immeasurable trauma and shit that goes on this fucking planet. It was Miss Sophia, then possibly acting on behalf of the divine, that beget everything that we now come to understand as education for the soul. So in her mistake, even if it was blasphemous at the time, we would not be here had it not be for an incredible divine feminine energy by the name of Sophia, who, by the way, is a rose. And just so we're all clear, the word paloma in Spanish means bird, a dove. She gave us our wings. It is her legacy that leads us home. It's in her act of sheer repentance and understanding why the divine had said, do not do this. Don't eat from this. Don't do this. You can't save your children from making their mistakes. Sometimes children will learn the hard way. But imagine the gift that she brought him while she manned the 13th eon now, standing in her true power, able to withstand incredible amounts of pressure from any direction that comes at her. And now she looks at you and she asks you, do you remember? Do you remember this bedtime story? Do you understand how powerful you are? You, as descendants of both energies, of both Jesus and all of them, that you are the ones that have the ability, thanks to her sacrifice, to do the work that she did. And if you read Princess Sophia, it will become clearer and clearer as long as you have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. This is not about bashing one side or some religion or anything like that, but it gives you reverence for something greater than ourselves, which is nothing in creation does not come with some sort of unity. It is the creative mind of the all and the feminine quality of caring and loving that begets the universe we reside in. And so it's time we put respect on her name. It is time for you to understand what we are witnessing in the reemergence of Miss Sophia, the rise of the divine feminine. And the reason we know that is we see all the signs. So let's look at our real world setting without getting politics or any of that. But notice how when you begin the journey of spirituality, one of the first things you have to do is integrate your shadow into your ego. And your ego and your shadow begin to make war with each other. And as that becomes integrated, you then move on to the emotional landscape and the battle between the ego and the emotions. And then the emotions integrate in the shadow, and then you move on to the next part. Then after that, the brain begins to battle with the ego, because the ego is saying, I am always right, I've led the way, you're only successful in the material world because of me. And your brain goes, wait a minute, what the fuck about me? So now you have the body, the mind, and the soul now working with each other. So the mind wins over the ego as best as it can, and the ego goes to battle with the soul. And the soul then integrates the shadow and the ego and the body and the emotions into itself as it begins to become whole again, meaning it begins to become one. And as it moves into a streamlined version of itself, it begins to rise. And you begin to encounter things within our world that for spiritual students lead you down different corridors, different books, and different fields of study, where just the act sometimes of reading it allows you to avoid the mistakes that others have made. And it also allows you the knowledge and wisdom to follow the breadcrumbs that speak to your soul, that reveal the light within you, to then illuminate the shadows cast against you. And so now your soul begins to integrate all of these qualities into itself. And now you're standing on a mountaintop. And now you are fighting for your survival. And you understand that whatever path you take, you're going to have to stand against all forces of darkness. And when you rage that war, all hell can break loose and everything you have you lose. And suddenly you're in the dark night of the soul. And you're like, oh my God, I'm so alone. And the reality is, your Divine Mother already showed you how to get through it. You just keep going. In fact, it's Miss Sophia that lives within you that tells you you can. It is no mistake that in the universe, everything spirals like a flower being twirled. If you look at it as expansive like rose petals. In fact, in Buddhist texts and other sacred texts, we refer to it as the lily and the lotus, the Buddha being the lotus, and the lily being you. There's a reason why the most beautiful rose in the world is Sophia, and why the smell of a rose will always bring you to light. Because it's something that rises against all odds from the ashes. And she is the original phoenix, the original version of the divine that matched him. So we're not competing with the divine because he's the holy, he's the all. It's just an aspect of himself that it's time you know and that you learn. Regardless of which house you belong to, men and women are always equal. And there comes a point when we start to see externally the world begin to balance that out. There's a reason why politically so many toxic masculines are trying to suppress the feminine, and why this whole backlash of non-gendered beings is such a big deal. But in reality, all of the people who are having the biggest crisis over it believe in angels who are non-gendered. And all of the most sacred texts, you see that many of the Greek cultures and some of the more ancient beings depicted us as being masculine and feminine united as one with two heads, and that the journey is to unite. But instead of thinking about it in the physical terms, realize that it is the balance of the masculine and feminine within that makes you whole. And anyone who stands in the way of you integrating that is not your friend. And that's going to become increasingly important as we begin to move forward. But be not mistaken if you are in the dark night of the soul. There is the egoish version of that, which is the ego death where it realizes it was wrong and has to become a little bit more subservient to the soul who's trying to save it from complete destruction, which we're seeing all across it, right? The worst type of men are like toxic men, raping, like we have all these people doing unspeakable things to children, billionaires that we think that they think is going to get away with it and they're not. And then you have people who have 18 different girlfriends with 18 different kids, complete absent father, no real kid. It's the mother. Okay, all of that is the tension between the demiurge and Miss Sophia. But remember, in the end, the demiurge was born from Sophia, and from it, in spite of it, she still overcame the ego to become the queen of a universe that we now embody. And as you make your way to it, I hope that you will find her in the grace and the love and the light that she gave you in her sacrifice. You see, in the integration, the masculine and feminine stop fighting with each other. And the toxicity of the shadow becomes serving it as opposed to opposing it. As the more that you work your way up through the levels of hell or whatever your course load is, you begin to integrate them into a unified vision, a streamlined process that begins to go up. Almost like the chakras, integrating. They no longer are rubbing against each other. Instead, they're dancing together, if you want to look at it that way. I'm a little woo-woo, I get that, but you understand the concept. But in the end, the divine already answered the question of why he doesn't make himself more known before the demiurge, who is straight out throwing temper tantrums and bitch fitting, and you see it all. I mean, if you're the worst of us is the demiurge having a complete meltdown. And the best of us are looking at it going, that's kind of sad. And as those two things battle, you begin to see who's on what side by the actions they're taking. Sometimes when you live in your shadow and you have an internal fear, you listen to the demiurge believing it's the divine, and the divine's like, quiet. Why is he going to try to sway you one way or the other? It is your journey. He does not need to prove himself to you. In the same way that divine elders and masters do not need to reveal who they are to you. You should know them and see them if you have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. So for those of you journeymen making your way to the 13th eon, to the 13th mystery, do not make the mistake the others have made in playing it down. Just because she is humble does not mean that she's not powerful. And it doesn't mean that she can't overcome anything. The Christ and Miss Sophia are one. One is a masculine, one is a feminine, and they do not compete. There's no risk to the divine at all if we know who Miss Sophia is, because it is one of his children. It's one of his direct heirs. She's the archetype who stands between the ethers and us. And she is, in her journey, in the same that Mary Magdalene, in her journey, the embodiment of what it means to ascend from the darkness and become the phoenix who brought all this forth. You see, when she got back to her post, she offered her wisdom of what she had acquired to the divine, who saw it was good. And she sits now rightfully on her throne again, having proven herself the way that those of you who are willing to do the work of all of this will also one day sit and bask in her and his glory. This is not competitive towards religion. It adds another layer to it. Because in the end, in Pistis Sophia, it's not some arbitrary figure. It's Jesus talking to Mary Magdalene. That's right. The one that they besmirched, if you think about it, it makes sense. The demiurge probably hated Mary Magdalene like nobody's business. In fact, if you read Pistis Sophia, I'm not going to get into the others in the fucking discipleship, but there's some petty shit going on in that. Like, I'm telling you, you want to read an amazing bedtime story, you read that fucking book. Like that, and it takes a minute. And you're going to have to read it more than once. So I'm giving you kind of an abridged version just because it's so interesting. But it sat in my soul. I knew this. This was not something that was confusing to me. I remember the first time I read it, I'm like, oh, I understand why Mary Magdalene. But the more layer and the more I looked at it, and the more I kind of peeled back that onion, I was like, oh, I know you. And I felt like so familiar because I realized just as much as the divine lives in me as a masculine, the divine feminine is the one who speaks to hope. She is the compassion versus the mind. And you can always tell when someone is actually as enlightened as they say they are by how they treat the other gender or how they treat people around them. You see, the divine, and those of you who are divine children, have nothing to prove to anyone else. For in the journey of Miss Sophia home, she was cleared. And Jesus sat behind her, did not cause any stir, and he led her by hand. Because the divine, the true God, made it so. And as she made her way home, she left you with the pathway by which to get back to where you belong. So, as you do these studies, my point is this. Don't believe other people's opinions of things until you do the work yourself. Because no matter what you believe, if you have not come to know it in your core and experience it, then you may just be but a glib student who is being fed information that may not be accurate. And the only way to know it is to embody it and do the best you can every day of your life. With grace, with gratitude, with prayer, and with an immense amount of love for the energies that brought you into manifestation. And the only way to get out is to realize that some of the things that you've been looking at that have been vilified are sometimes the answer to some of your prayers. And in the end, it's time to put respect on their names. They can say what they want about you, They can do what they want against you, but in the end, they cannot take away the power you hold from what you have incurred and what you have overcome. And one day, hopefully, you will step before Miss Sophia and she will lay you in to the highest of places. I hope you guys have a really great day. Bye. Go Dodgers. I'm going to go watch the game. Bye. I